I'm Peter Waldron. I'm Professor of Modern History at the University of East Anglia, and I'm going to talk about Russia in the early 20th century. I want to start by talking about what the Russian Empire looks like in 1900 and what are the challenges that face it. The first thing to remember is that Russia is the largest state in the world at the start of the 20th century, but that it's expanded very rapidly indeed. It's only in the 1870s that Russia actually achieves its final form. So for more than 200 years before that, the Russian Empire has been growing and growing and growing, acquiring territories in the Far East, in Siberia, in Central Asia, and in Europe. This then is an enormous empire. Russia is multinational, it's multilingual, it's multi-religious. There are more than 100 different languages spoken by the inhabitants of the Russian Empire. So this then is one of the world's great powers. It's one of the world's great imperial states. And that is the prime motive for the politics of late Tsarist Russia. Russia is an autocracy. It's ruled by the Tsar, and until 1905 there are no checks on the power of the autocratic monarch at all. There is no parliament, there are no political parties, that there is no mechanism by which the Tsar's word can be challenged. So here is a vast empire ruled by an absolute monarch, a man at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries, who has complete power over the peoples, the 100 and something million people of the Russian Empire. Autocracy then is seen by the Tsar in St. Petersburg as being the key to maintaining order in this vast and rapidly expanding state. But at the same time, then Russia is not immune from the wider pressures of modernization that have been gripping Western Europe since the late 18th century. And Russia has got to try to, in some ways, copy what's happening in Western Europe. The Russian state, the Russian government, has no desire to copy Western European models of political development. For the Russian conservatives, the idea of a parliamentary state is anathema. They hate the idea of giving any sort of power to the Russian people. But their status as a great power, their status as a great empire, means that Russia needs to develop its economy, that Russia needs to be able to develop, in particular, heavy industry that will be able to provide armaments, provide equipment for its army, and thus will be able to maintain Russia's international status. And this, I think, that this is the key motivation for what's happening in Russia at the start of the 20th century. This absolute need to maintain its position as a great imperial, a great world power. And so while the autocratic monarch sits there in St. Petersburg, wanting to preserve his conservative traditional method of ruling, at the same time in the 1890s and the first years of the 20th century, there's huge pressure from inside the Russian government to modernize the Russian economy, to invest in industry, to develop the railway network across the Russian Empire, to draw in foreign investments that will help to finance this industrial revolution. And it's that pressure to modernize that wins out over the political conservatism. The Russian regime accepts that this is its primary need at the start of the 20th century. In the late 1890s, Russia is achieving economic growth of around about 8% a year. This is growing very, very rapidly indeed. But of course, with economic change comes profound social change. Russia is overwhelmingly an agrarian economy. 80% of its population live and work on the land. But economic modernization means urbanization. It means that the very rapid growth of Russia's great cities, in particular Moscow and St. Petersburg. In the first years of the 20th century, Moscow and Petersburg both have populations of more than 1 million people. They're both in the 10 largest cities in Europe. And thus, Russian society is changing. Yes, it's still overwhelmingly agrarian, it's still overwhelmingly a peasant-based economy, but large numbers of skilled working men, and it's overwhelmingly men who make up the Russian working class at the start of the 20th century. Large numbers of Russian working men are being concentrated in a relatively small number of very large cities indeed. So we can see here that there's the potential for great conflict, great tension inside Russian society. A deeply conservative political regime which resents having the idea of having to give up any of its power at all. But on the other hand, modernisation and the regime's absolute need to remain as a great military, a great imperial power, means that it has got to pursue economic change. It's got to pursue industrial revolution. Even though the consequences of industrial revolution, a growing working class, a more articulate and larger professional middle class, even though the consequences of industrial revolution are going to pose a very serious threat indeed to the political stability of the empire. So by 1900 then, we've got contradictions in Russian society. Here are unresolved tensions that make the continuation of this deeply conservative political regime more and more difficult as the years go on. Although political parties are illegal, that doesn't stop clandestine groups establishing themselves and spreading the word, particularly amongst the Russian working class. In 1898, the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party is formed secretly. This is the party that's going to, by 1917, turn itself into the Bolsheviks, who are going to seize power. So we can see that even by 1900, some of the roots of revolution are already taking shape in late imperial Russia. That this is a society where stability, its traditional stability, is coming under challenge. Lastly, Russia in 1900 is facing great challenges to its international prestige. Russia has grown very, very rapidly indeed over the previous 150 years. It's acquired this vast empire that stretches from the Baltic Sea in the north west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. But an important part of this imperial expansion is that it's drawn into the empire a huge number of people who are not Russian by nationality, who speak different languages, who don't adhere to the Russian Orthodox Church. But Russia has got dozens of national minorities. And the Russian Empire is not immune during the late 19th century from the nationalist pressures which have swept across most of Europe over the previous 50 or 75 years. So, as well as economic modernisation challenging the political status quo in Russia, increasingly the national minorities, the people who've been conquered and colonised by Russia as part of its imperial expansion, these too, the Finns, the Poles, the peoples of the Caucasus, they too are beginning to show signs of discontent with the Russian regime. Russia then, on the surface at the start of the 20th century, looks to be a stable state. Nicholas II, it seems, is the most powerful monarch in Europe. But if we dig just a little bit beneath the surface, then we can see there that Russia is faced with immense challenges, and that it's going to take very, very great political skill if the Russian Empire is going to be able to emerge unscathed.